Hello, so I wanted to do a video today about advice I would give rock and blues players making their first moves into playing jazz. And the first thing I'm not going to talk about is really that much theory. I think there's plenty of videos out there for that, if you're interested. I also think there's a kind of idea that jazz has to do with music theory, and it doesn't necessarily. Music theory has to do with music in general, and jazz is a form of music. You don't really need any theory to play jazz. You need good ears. Perhaps you need some theory to play the very contemporary stuff, you know, like Kurt Rosenwinkel and, you know, Alan Holdsworth, people like that. But I think, like, when it comes to the more traditional forms of jazz, swing, bebop, gypsy jazz, things like that, actually mostly it's about the ears and about how well you can hear lines and work them out and then play them back, and then how you can develop a language that way. So I'll say that right away. Of course, you know, lots of people like theory and are always asking about theory, and there's nothing wrong with music theory, but I just wanted to make that distinction right away. So I'm going to sort of talk about everything which isn't theory, which I think is good to know about jazz guitar for somebody just starting out. So the first thing is, like, forget scales, right? Being good at jazz isn't about knowing 8 million scales. It really isn't. Okay, so the second thing, chords equals lines. And I think this is something we often overlook in rock guitar, but also jazz as well, because I think people are used to thinking when they learn, that's certainly the way I learn, it's like, okay, you've got these chords here, say, for a song, and over that you might play the A minor pentatonic. And when you get a little bit more knowledgeable about scales, you might say, well, I'm going to play the Aeolian mode, you know. You know, and like that's a conventional, very traditional kind of rock guitar which I grew up with, Jimmy Page, Dave Gilmour, that sort of thing. But interestingly enough, actually, if you listen to people like, for instance, Dave Gilmour, he understands that this chord shape here, which is like D up an octave, can be a source of a line, right? And also, you know, to take another very, you know, this kind of stuff, right? So, might come across this, or, you know, in the case of Jimi Hendrix, this kind of playing. Which is very much oriented around playing the chords and expressing the chords. So, of course, you know, if you get into jazz seriously, you're going to learn a whole load of different chord voicings. You know, for instance, I might play, you know, 2-5-1, for instance, like this. And none of these chords are used that much in rock playing, but you can. What I'm doing there is I'm just taking these voicings. You know, there could be, let's say that D minor 7 is probably, I usually play like that. It's actually quite familiar from like Nile Rodgers and stuff, this shape. So you take the top 4 notes of that, express them as a line, and then we've got the second chord, which is this G7 flat 13 sharp 9 thing. But you know, you don't have to know what the note numbers are, it's just a shape like that. It's a cool way of playing a G. You know, we could play, you know, G7 sharp 9, which might be a more familiar shape, and in this, those are the same notes in that position, and then turn that into a line. And then C major 7, everybody knows that's a jazz chord. Play the top 4 notes of each chord, so we have something like this. You know, as we get more sophisticated, add chromatics in. It's a good one. So that's like a D shape, up 2 frets with a G in the bass, or an F. Remember that one, that's a useful all-round jazz chord. Great for fusion as well. Okay, so I'm really going by the shapes. And there's nothing wrong by going by the shapes. And, you know, 2 of the greatest, perhaps we could also make the same claim for Wes Montgomery. So 3 of the greatest jazz guitarists of all time, you know, Wes Montgomery, Charlie Christian and Django Reinhardt, were primarily shapes players. I would also argue that Peter Bernstein is primarily a shapes player. You can literally see him playing lines out of, like out of 13th chord shapes and stuff, which, is all stuff you'll know if you've gone, for instance, through the rock school grades. So it's like, I think we get a little bit in our heads about the idea of like there being a separation between chords and melody, but like as Keith Richards said, you don't go into a shop and say, I'm going to buy a lead guitar or a rhythm guitar, because they're meshed together. And I think what's gone wrong with our teaching generally is the idea that there is separate lead and rhythm guitar. I mean, I know in gypsy jazz there's kind of two roles, and that does have a tradition within gypsy jazz. But in general, I mean, if you're the only guitarist in a band, you have to cover a lot of bases. And I think like there's loads of examples of really good players doing that, regardless of whether they play rock, country, blues, folk, or jazz. So I think that's just good guitar playing, right? Learning how to fill up the space. Okay, and look at Chuck Berry, and Chuck Berry took all his stuff from Charlie Christian. So there's a link right there. If you know your Chuck Berry licks, then you'll be able to sort of see how that works within a sort of swing and kind of jump blues kind of context. That might be a way in. Okay, here's an important thing, articulation and tone, right? So articulation is how you make the notes happen. And that's really important. So I think like phrasing, all that stuff's kind of linked together in my head. So if we play like an A minor pentatonic in a bluesy sort of way, I mean, we're using obviously a lot of bends and a lot of pull-offs, and hammer-ons, and obviously that can be very virtuosic in a sort of Joe Satriani kind of way. I won't demonstrate it because if I try to do it now I'll fall flat on my face and everyone will laugh. So I'm a blues guy, I was never a shredder. So that is obviously a very blues or a traditional rock way of doing it. But if I wanted to play improvise on the A minor pentatonic scale in jazz, have a listen to how different it is. So I'm using a couple of little things there which are obviously not completely from the pentatonic scales, such as the major third. But that's just to limit it out. I mean, like one of the first tunes you might learn is Sunny Moon for Two by Sonny Rollins, which most people play like this. And every rock guitarist is going to be able to have a way into that because, of course, it's just a B flat box shape, right? Okay, so important things about it is like I'm playing less of this kind of sound, less of that stinging blues sound. Now, some lovely, probably rock player has set up my Telecaster with a super low action, so everything just sounds like twangy. I have to be really careful, okay? But I've currently got my tone wide open, so again, like I'm trying to sort of pick up near the neck and not pick too hard, which gives me a sort of more mellow sound, right? But you obviously might want to turn your tone down, but don't turn it down too much. See how little you can get away with. And it's like, if I'm going to play articulations, there will usually be slides. Now, there's nothing wrong with pull-offs. That's a little lick, there you go, little jazz lick, from 3 up to flat 5. Okay, less vibrato obviously as well. If you do vibrato, it'll probably be a... So I think really good exercise is to sort of just try, play maybe a phrase as you would as a rock or blues player. So this little... I'm actually bending up to a non-blues note there. Now, you hear this often with Dave Gilmour, right? You know, and just see if you can turn it into a more jazz phrase. So just use exactly the same notes, you know, and just see if you can change the articulation, the tone, how you phrase the notes, how you might... how you might change the articulation from one thing to the other. Very good for your musicianship. Not all musicianship is about notes, right? A lot of it is about how you play something, your sensitivity to tone and touch. So another thing is shell voicings. Shell voicings are something I started off by learning, and they were a bit of a struggle at first, but I'm really glad that I persisted with them. And there's really only two positions for most shell chords that you need to know to start off with. So shell voicings are things with the root, the third, and the seventh in. So this is root, seventh, third, root, third, seventh. And one of the big things I think that the rock players who go into jazz have trouble getting their head around is the idea that you might only play a few notes in a chord, as opposed to like loads of notes, as opposed to these sorts of things. You know, if your idea of a minor seventh chord is this, that's not necessary in jazz. We just play three notes from that, and that's sufficient. And then later on we can add extensions. Yeah. So, but the actual sort of basis of it is really simple, a really straightforward little groupings, and the fingerings are simple as well. If you look, I'm not really moving my fingers very much, right? So that's one of the first things I would tell any student interested in learning jazz, is like get into the shell voicings around a few basic tunes. That was a song called Autumn Leaves, which has very similar chords to Gary Moore's Parisian Walkways, for instance. And that's a good, really good tune to start with. Okay, right, so the sixth thing, that's an interesting one. Guitar isn't really that important in jazz, right? You're going to find, there are obviously great jazz guitarists, and the people you should definitely check out would include Eddie Lang, because he started it all off, Django Reinhardt, the great virtuoso of the 1930s and 40s, still one of the most famous, if not the most famous jazz guitarist to most people. Charlie Christian, who basically popularized the electric guitar. Kind of important for everybody to know who he is, because he invented the language. He invented all these sorts of things that we play. You know, which we all think of as being like Chuck Berry licks, or maybe Freddie King licks, you know. And he also jammed with T-Bone Walker, so you can see why there's a sort of big common influence between electric Chicago blues and that sort of swing jazz style that he played. So Charlie Christian is hugely influential not only on jazz guitarists but also on rock and roll players, right? You know, like Chuck Berry, blues players like B.B. King and so on. Okay, so then you have Wes Montgomery, really important. I also love Grant Green. There are many fantastic players from the 1950s, but he's the guy who kind of moved the goalposts. Wes Montgomery, really, you've got to check him out. Jim Hall is wonderful, although if you're not really into jazz, I think maybe his playing might seem a little bit like, oh, what's the fuss? You know, if you want to listen to some virtuoso, knock your head off guitar playing, then Joe Pass can't be bettered, really, for that period. Then there's the great fusion players. You might be more familiar with them. There's people, obviously, like John McLaughlin and Alan Holdsworth and Aldo Meola, who are great virtuosos in the era. But, you know, there's also amazing musicians like a lot of people love, for instance, God, what's his name? 335 guy, plays a 335, played in everybody's records. It's gone. My brain is failing. I'm sure you can work it out. Robin Ford, probably the guy who got me into playing changes as a lovely combination between blues and rock and jazz. You know, he's a great player, and so on and so forth. And then recently, people like Kurt Rosenwinkel have really shaken things up. Pat Metheny as well, obviously. You know, between those guys, Pat Metheny was hugely influential. John Scofield, Mike Stern, Bill Frisell. All these players are well worth checking out. And there's many, many more besides. Like, there's loads of fantastic players from the past 10 years. I can't keep track of everybody who's coming up because it's such a rich and vital scene at the moment. But all of that said, jazz guitarists aren't really that important to the history of the music. And if you want to understand jazz, you have to listen to pianists, sax players, and drummers and bass players, I'd say, as well, and trumpeters, you know. Singers are fantastic for phrasing. I never thought I'd be sort of raiding, the Frank Sinatra sort of record back catalogue for ideas on how to phrase standards, but that's the place where you find yourself because there was nobody better at phrasing than Frank Sinatra, you know. So, you know, you're right, going right back to some serious kind of mainstream music from the 1950s, but, you know, it all influences everything else. So, you know, like, it's great to listen to that music, and there was this great sort of grey area between what exactly is jazz and what exactly was the popular music of the 1950s, for instance, or 40s. There's a lot of overlap. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to talk about is swing. And the reason why I want to talk about swing last is it's kind of the most complicated subject, and I'm trying to do videos which talk about it a bit more. But on the whole, if you're a rock guitarist, you will tend to slur like this. If you listen to my foot going one amp, one amp, one amp, so you will play a note on the beat one, and then you will do like a pull off or a hammer on. If you're doing like a triplet lick, like, or if you're doing, okay, so you'll slur in that way, by which I mean you pick the note on the beat and then you slur to the other notes. And in jazz, you can get a really good swing feel if you kind of reverse that. So instead of going so you're kind of on the upbeat. So the upbeat's really important. What is an upbeat? Well, the upbeat is the beat that goes in between the beats, right? So, or the note that goes in between the beats. So one and two and three and four and one and two and three and four and, okay. So da 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 da. Now any player can improve their phrasing if they learn how to get more into the ands. And a lot of rock music is kind of written in what jazzers would understand as half time. So it's 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a lot of modern music, you know, hip hop, funk is kind of based on that sort of 1 and a 2 and a, but in jazz we're often 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Like where we're kind of thinking about it at twice the speed, but it's kind of the same rhythms. This might be confusing at first, but it's why, like, you know, jazz tunes are often like played at sort of 240 beats a minute, and most rock players would understand that as 120. Bit of a re-gearing of your head there. But in both cases, it's like gives you a bit more funk, right? So, you know, thinking about like the upbeats can really help funk up your rock playing, and obviously people like Jimmy, you know, fantastic at that. Remember, used to listen to a guy called Nuno Betancourt in a band called Extreme, amazing guitar player. He was very funky, always on the upbeats. Great player. Now he plays Rihanna, of course. So in jazz, that upbeat is swung. So instead of being one E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 is a or if we do it in jazz counting, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And notice that I'm clicking my fingers on 2 and 4 like the backbeat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Let's slow it down. 1 E and a 2. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and da. Now the important thing is that you don't try to go do dee do dee do dee do dee do, because that sounds terrible. Nobody wants to hear that. So what you do is you actually learn how to feel where the upbeats are with the swing. Da 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 ba ba ba. That's a good exercise. Tapping my foot on all the beats. 1, 2, 3. Button 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 button. Button, 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 button. Good way of locating that swung upbeat. Nina Simone, My Baby Just Cares For Me. So that's kind of an example of what we might call a jive pattern. And of course you can hear that in early rock and roll. And blues has a shuffle as well. You know, if we play... If we play that kind of groove, so for most blues players that won't be completely alien. But just like learning how to really key into the upbeat, is really important. Then when you practice your scales, let's take for instance, let's do an A minor pentatonic, why not? So we're going to accent the upbeats. Okay, so instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going 1 and 2 and. So I'll do that without the counting. So I don't know if you can hear my foot there. I'll do it a little slower. Okay. And with your slurring, you can actually help that. So instead of going, start on beat 1, instead of slurring into that note, oh, it's going to be hard actually. Let's start on the upbeat. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So you can see, and I'm also doing upstrokes on each one, that I'm starting each of my slurred couples of notes on the and. So I'm starting that phrase on the and of 1. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. So you want to make it nice. That's the wrong way to do it because that's too it's too like pinched. Whereas you want to make it a bit smoother and a bit more even. And that will give you a better swing feel using legato, right? You could do it with obviously with any scale. So if I start on the beat and do the Aeolian, start on the C, on the third. 1, 2. So, sorry I can't play the Aeolian, but to be picked, right? So pick, slur, pick. And we're on the beat, pick, so you slur there. And we can slur there, right, using a slide. And you can hear that's more of a swing feel, even though we're not going dee da dee da dee. Sorry, I'm doing it wrong. And you don't have to slur every note, but that's the way you would use hammer-ons and pull-offs. If I go up using hammer-ons. You know, same thing, right? So you're picking the note on the upbeat and you're slurring onto the downbeat. That's kind of backwards probably from the way you do it at the moment, especially if you're used to playing lots of speed licks, you know, where you kind of, you know, synchronize each of the first notes with the beat, okay? But that's the way you do it if you want to get a swing feel, okay? I hope all of that info is useful because I would love to have known that when I was starting to play jazz. I hope you find it helpful. Please post any comments or further questions you might have below because I haven't been a rock player for a while, so there might be loads of really basic stuff that you're burning to ask which I haven't addressed in this video. If so, please post below. Thanks for watching.